Hello, we're outside the Treasury where a group today is protesting against millionaires and say that the super rich need to pay a higher share of tax. I'm Michael Simmons. Welcome to Reality Check.
Hey, Rachel! Ooh, I wanna know if your tax are rich.
Hi there, my name's Hannah. I'm from Green Needle Rising. We're a movement of young people and we're campaigning for a fairer, safer future. And part of that future, we think, is creating a sustainable economy. So we're calling on Rachel Reeves to introduce a series of wealth taxes in the upcoming budget so that we can raise really necessary revenue for public services, for NHS, for hospitals, for schools, but also to tackle the climate crisis. A lot of the young people who are here today, they're living in a world that is likely to be harder than, what their parents experience. They're coming out of university with tens of thousands of pounds worth of debt. A lot of them are working 2 jobs, 3 jobs to try and pay rent. Housing is unaffordable. They're also looking at a climate crisis that is escalating. And we think that there are lots of ways to tackle those problems, but one thing that could be done is looking at where wealth is held in our society and looking at the very top where, a few individuals and corporations are hoarding wealth at the top, and we need to access that wealth and redistribute it so that we have more revenue for everybody else.
And does it not worry you, all the evidence we have that wealth taxes actually don't work? The people that have got the wealth will just leave the country and tax revenues might actually go down.
Well, if you're looking at, things like the Henley and Partners report, which was a kind of overhyped report that they released about capital flight, actually that was based on some pretty dodgy methodology and figures looking at LinkedIn profiles. Groups like Patriotic Millionaires have done surveys of millionaires in Britain, and 65% of those people said that they would actually like to pay more tax because they understand that contributing to the society that they live in, that they benefit from, is an important part of being a citizen. I think when you look around you and you see the levels of inequality that exist in our country right now, I think you have to admit that things are maybe not working out very well. At the moment, 1 in 3 children are in poverty in the UK in 2025. That means in a classroom, 10 out of 30 children are living and growing up in poverty. Now, wealth taxes are obviously just one part of the picture of how you deal with that, but they're an important part and something that the Chancellor should be really considering as a method of increasing revenue, but also of reducing inequality, which is out of control at the moment.
But the top 1% already pay something like a third of all income tax. Aren't they already paying their fair share?
Well, what we're here today to talk about is a series of taxes that are not to do with income tax. We're here to talk about things like a 2% tax on people that have assets of over £10 million per year. That actually only affects, the estimate is about 20,000 people. So we're talking about a really tiny number of people, potentially contributing a little bit more to make society fairer and to improve our public services. And also things that just don't make any sense, like why do we pay, why is the rate of capital gains tax in this country the lowest in the G7? At the moment, Rishi Sunak, who is as rich as the king, in 2022, he paid the same effective tax rate as a nurse because of how little we tax the income gained from wealth, from things like selling shares. That just doesn't make sense. And I think a lot of people in this country understand that doesn't make sense, which is why wealth taxes are actually incredibly popular amongst the general public. And it's why young people particularly, they're looking at the world they're inheriting and they're saying, do you know what? This isn't fair. We already pay our fair share. It's time for the very richest to pay theirs.
Those protesters take issue with the media's reporting of this wealth exodus, the idea that millionaires are fleeing the country because of how high taxes have become. I'm taking that a little bit personally because back in May, I wrote this Spectator's cover story, Go, which predicted that non-doms specifically and some of our wealthiest taxpayers were already leaving and more were going to go. The protesters say that's wrong and that my data is really dodgy, but I'm going to tell you why actually they're wrong and I'm right. So what's the data that they take issue with? Well, it's a projection from an organisation called New World Wealth. And they said that this year, 16,500 millionaires were going to flee the UK. And that's more than they say is going to leave any other country. They say they're going to places like the UAE, the USA, Italy, but Britain is in the worst position in terms of wealthy leaving, worse than China, worse than Russia. And not only that, they're taking a staggering amount of money with them. The New World Wealth data suggests that nearly $100 million of cash is going to leave with these people from the UK this year. And that would be obviously catastrophic for the Chancellor, but also for all of us. But the reason the protesters think that this is not an issue and it's actually not true that they're leaving is because of a report by this organisation, Tax Justice Network. They teamed up with another organisation, Patriotic Millionaires UK, who are a group of wealthy Brits who say that they could be taxed even more. Now, I might suggest that there's nothing stopping them dropping a donation in the HMRC, but that's perhaps besides the point. Now, their report basically criticises the New World Wealth and Henley and Partners data because of its sources. Part of the way they gather their data on the sort of migration of millionaires is by looking at the LinkedIn profiles of CEOs, of company founders, and by looking at where they move. And they say that's not a valid methodology. Now, that's kind of odd because survey sources are used by all sorts of places, not least our own, ONS uses surveys all the time. In COVID, they were looking at people shopping in Pret to try and make estimates about working from home. So it's not unusual, say, to use LinkedIn as a source. I don't really see what's wrong with that. But in fairness, it's not just Tax Justice Network that are making this criticism. There was a headline in the Financial Times a couple of weeks ago that said that tax data suggested that fears about the non-dom exodus had been overblown. Things were not actually that bad. And the Chancellor, for her part, seems reassured. That should please the protesters we were talking to this morning, because if this Guardian report's to be believed, then the protesters should be very happy because Rachel Reeves is going to give them exactly what they want. She said that those with the broadest shoulders should bear the widest burden, and she's suggesting that in her budget on the 26th of November, she's going to squeeze the wealthy even more with more wealth taxes. But I think that's a problem because I think the protesters are wrong and I think I'm right. Those with the broadest shoulders also have the longest legs. It's easiest for them to leave. But the problem for the protesters is that's not the only thing to suggest that the tax take from wealthy people has gone down because they're leaving. We sort of see it in hard tax return data as well. The Treasury collects data on the proportion that the wealthy pay in tax, the proportion all of us pay in tax. And it's really interesting if we take a look at the top 1%. For years, they've been paying something like 28% of all income tax. If you include other taxes, it gets something like a third of tax. But the latest projection suggests that that number is going to fall to about 27%, somewhere between 26 and 27%. So first things first, despite us increasing our taxes on the wealthy, it's not doing what the protesters want. It's reducing the share paid by the wealthy. And that's partly because of this evidence that the richest taxpayers are leaving. There's another factor going on here too, of course, which is fiscal drag, the freezing of thresholds by which people start paying income tax or go further up the tax spectrum. And that's something that successive chancellors have used to fill black holes. And every suggestion is that the chancellor will extend that again another 2 years when it comes to her budget. And the result of that is more people sort of approach that higher end group. But that wouldn't be enough to make the graph go down in the way it has. It has to be because there are less wealthy people here paying tax as well. If we look at capital gains tax receipts, and that's a tax that tends to be, by its very nature, paid more by wealthy individuals, for sort of most of its recent history, it's gotten more each year. The taxman's been able to take more from this tax. But for the last 2 years, the receipts into HMRC from capital gains has fallen, which you wouldn't expect unless there was less wealthy people. But I think clearer than all that I'm actually right and this wealth exodus has happened is because the Treasury's actually admitted it. If we think back to that Financial Times headline, they've got a source from the Treasury who says that, oh, we're not that worried because it's not been worse than the OBR's projection. So let's take a look at what the OBR actually said. So this was a report into what would happen if you tightened up the non-dom regime. And I can read the key bit out for you. They modelled that for non-doms with trusts, so the wealthiest kind of non-doms, and the people who were most likely to be targeted by the reforms from both originally the Tories and then continued and made more stringent by Rachel Reeves, that 25% would leave. So 1 in 4. So what that Financial Times story seems to actually suggest is that 1 in 4 have gone. And that's a lot more than the 70 odd that Labour expected when they were talking to academics about doing these reforms before they were elected. That's a lot of people and a lot of tax money with them. But why does any of that matter? Well, again, it's worth reiterating this point about how much they pay. As I've said, the top 1% of earners in the UK are responsible for 28% of income tax. But things get really scary when you zoom in on the very richest people, the 0.01% top earners. And that's not a large group of people. They're responsible for like a staggering amount of tax. If even just one of those top taxpayers leave, we'd need 1,300 average taxpayers to replace them. So we'd need to create 1,300 average paying jobs for just one rich non-dom or one rich millionaire who's left. And given how many jobs we've lost since the £25 billion raid on employer national insurance, it's quite difficult to see where that would come from. Even if you were to accept that somehow I've misinterpreted these tax figures, somehow the New World Wealth data was wrong or an overestimate, we know from just reading the financial press every day that, you know, people are leaving. We see company CEOs leaving. We see football club owners leaving. That's all well documented. And remember, for every single example I can find, that's potentially over 1,000 average taxpayers needed to replace them. Good old-fashioned journalism tells us this too. I've been on the phone to wealth fund managers, to lawyers for the rich, and some of them are kind of distraught that literally their entire client book, 100% of the people they represent have left the country. Now, you might say, well, boo-hoo, little sympathy for them, but for the reasons I've set out, that really matters. And you don't just have to be on the phone or looking in a spreadsheet. We can just open our eyes to all the clues that money, that wealth is leaving the country. If it weren't the case, how can it be that London is the only part of England that's seeing house prices fall? Why is a luxury storage company opening up in Mayfair to look after fine wines and arts of people that apparently don't have houses here anymore to store it? This stuff really matters because Britain is over-reliant on the wealthy for everything we spend hundreds of billions of pounds on welfare, on NHS, on education. And if we do more in this budget, if the Chancellor does more in this budget to scare them off, to squeeze them even more, then protesters might be happy, but you and I will be a lot poorer.